How exactly did four ordinary young men from Liverpool become the most influential band in history? And why on earth did they break apart while they were still at the absolute peak of their game? Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to trace the unbelievable, totally wild journey of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. We're going to look at how they changed music forever, and we'll unpack the incredibly complex web of creativity, fame, and overwhelming pressure that eventually pulled them apart.
You know, it's a question that has fascinated fans for decades now. How did a group capable of conquering literally any stage in the world just fall apart after only a few years of massive global success? Well, as you'll see, it wasn't just one single thing. It's a sprawling, epic tale of deep friendship, fierce creative competition, a cultural revolution, and a level of pressure so immense that it completely transformed them. So, let's dive right into this and see how it all unfolded.
All right, let's start at the beginning. Part 1, From Liverpool to Hamburg.
Our story begins in a gritty English port city where imported American rock and roll records were giving a post-war generation something entirely fresh to dream about. Picture this, it's 1957, and John Lennon is performing with his skiffle band, the Quarrymen, when he meets a young guy named Paul McCartney. Paul had this great ear and an incredible memory for chords and lyrics. John realized right away that Paul was way too talented to leave out, even though he knew bringing him in meant creating some immediate competition for himself. And honestly, that specific combination of deep affection and fierce rivalry became their true creative engine. Soon after, Paul introduced a younger guitar player named George Harrison. After a few years of shifting lineups, changing their names a bunch of times, and grinding out a local following, Ringo Starr finally joins the crew in 1962, officially completing the legendary quartet.
But before Ringo officially completed that lineup, the band went through what we should really call the Hamburg effect. Back in the early 1960s, they traveled to Hamburg, Germany to play in these incredibly seedy nightclubs. And the conditions there were absolutely brutal. I mean, they lived in cramped, freezing quarters behind a cinema screen, slept very little, earned even less, and they were forced to play for up to 8 grueling hours every single night. But here's the thing, this punishing schedule forced them to vastly expand their repertoire. They developed an unmatched, explosive stage energy just to keep these demanding, rowdy audiences engaged. They went to Hamburg as pretty raw amateurs, and they returned as an absolute powerhouse of a live band.
So now they're back in Liverpool, playing these sweaty afternoon shows at an underground venue called the Cavern Club. That is where a young local record store manager named Brian Epstein was completely captivated by their charisma. He became their manager and immediately went to work polishing their rough edges. He demanded punctuality, put them in sharp, matching suits, but smartly made sure not to strip away their natural rebellious humor. After famously being rejected by Decca Records, who infamously and hilariously claimed that guitar groups are on the way out, Epstein just refused to give up. He finally secured an audition with producer George Martin at Parlophone Records. Martin saw their spark right away, and folks, the trajectory of popular music shifted forever. Which brings us to part 2, the explosion of Beatlemania.
That spark they showed in the studio didn't just catch fire. It became a global inferno. With the release of their first single, Love Me Do, the door was kicked wide open. By 1963, a phenomenon known as Beatlemania had completely swept across the United Kingdom. We are talking about scenes of pure, unprecedented chaos here. Screaming, crying, sprinting fans mobbing their every move. Fans even threw hard jelly beans at them on stage just because George casually mentioned in an interview that he liked them. The crowds were so deafeningly loud at their concerts that the music itself could barely even be heard, not by the audience and not even by the band.
So how in the world did they function creatively inside all this madness? Well, think about any successful team you've ever been a part of. You need a delicate balance of completely different personalities to thrive, right? John and Paul established themselves as an extraordinary core songwriting partnership, sharing that legendary Lennon-McCartney credit. John was often sharper, more cynical, and highly introspective, while Paul was highly melodic, optimistic, and a total perfectionist. On the flip side of that dynamic, George was quietly but steadily finding his own powerful, spiritual voice as a songwriter. And Ringo? He provided the essential rhythmic stability, infectious humor, and a highly recognizable drumming style that basically glued their entire sound together.
In 1964, the Beatles touched down in the United States. Their iconic performance on The Ed Sullivan Show was watched by an enormous television audience of 73 million people. Think about that number for a second. It single-handedly launched the British invasion. They even conquered cinema, starring in irreverent, wildly successful films like A Hard Day's Night, which only strengthened their spontaneous, charming public image. But behind this incredible, world-conquering success, a very serious problem was brewing. The endless, grueling tours and the total, absolute loss of any personal privacy were taking a heavy, heavy toll on all four of them.
This takes us into Part 3, Revolution in the Studio. What happened next transformed the band forever. Instead of breaking under the massive pressure of being on the road, they pivoted. The Beatles could have easily just repeated the pop idol formula that made them rich, but instead, they completely changed the rules. In 1966, entirely exhausted by the screaming fans, the security threats, the controversies, and the sheer absurdity of not even being able to hear themselves play, they performed their final paid concert in San Francisco and walked away from touring entirely. For almost any other band, leaving the stage means fading away into obscurity. But for the Beatles, the recording studio itself literally became their new instrument. They brought in complex arrangements, totally unexpected instruments, tape loops, and George introduced deep, mesmerizing elements of Indian classical music. This era of boundless creative freedom resulted in 1967's landmark masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Presented conceptually as a performance by this imaginary, vibrant band, it was packed with innovative recording techniques and lush orchestrations that had simply never been attempted in pop music before. They proved they were no longer merely pop stars. They were true cultural revolutionaries. They symbolized a generation that was actively questioning all the old rules and searching for entirely new ways of thinking and living.
But nothing lasts forever. Part 4, Cracks in the Foundation.
Right at this absolute peak of artistic triumph, the ground beneath them began to violently shift. In 1967, their manager, Brian Epstein, died unexpectedly. Now, Epstein didn't write the lyrics or play the chords, but he organized their entire business. He mediated their intense personal conflicts, and he kept the massive machine moving forward with this sort of paternal care. Without him, the band lost the one person capable of balancing their four very different, very strong personalities. The delicate balance they had relied on simply broke.
You can really feel the divide growing during the White Album era. In 1968, they traveled to India to study meditation, and they actually wrote much of that double album's material there. But the subsequent recording process back in London revealed they were clearly no longer functioning as a cohesive band. They all had highly separate artistic interests at this point. George was incredibly frustrated by the lack of space given to his rapidly improving songs. Ringo actually quit the band temporarily because the atmosphere had gotten so toxic. John began a deep artistic and personal relationship with Yoko Ono, whose constant, silent presence in the inner sanctum of the studio completely shifted the group's dynamic. And above all, there was a glaring, unanswered question hovering over them. Who is actually leading the Beatles now?
To make matters significantly worse, the financial side of things was totally unraveling. The Beatles had founded a company called Apple Corps to control their own creative projects, but it wildly hemorrhaged money and honestly just fueled more arguments. When it came time to try and fix the business, the band split directly in two. Paul desperately wanted management to go to the Eastman family, who were tied to his partner Linda. However, John, George, and Ringo firmly backed a tough, aggressive American businessman named Alan Klein. What started as a standard boardroom disagreement rapidly morphed into a bitter, highly personal fracture between former best friends.
And that leads us to Part 5, the final farewell.
This brings us to a band trying desperately to save its relationships and its music. In early 1969, they launched a project called Get Back. The idea was incredibly pure: get back to their roots, play together live, and record without all the studio trickery. But the cameras rolling during these sessions captured incredibly awkward silences and tense arguments, and George even walking out for a few days. Yet, you have to remember, they weren't in a permanent state of war. There was still a deep musical affection there, and they were still making extraordinary art. This all culminated on a freezing January day in 1969 with the legendary rooftop concert at their London headquarters. Without any announcement whatsoever, they just started playing live rock and roll while the city gathered in the streets below. It was a beautiful, completely informal, and ultimately final public performance.
Knowing the end was near, they decided to record one last great album with their trusted producer, George Martin. The result was Abbey Road. It truly is a farewell built from fragments. Although they had grown personally distant and were often recording their parts in separate studios, they worked with incredible discipline. George contributed two of his absolute greatest compositions, Something and Here Comes the Sun, proving his immense growth. And that famous musical medley on the second side of the album, it genuinely felt like a conscious, unified goodbye to the world.
So why exactly did it end? It's a really complex web, and there is absolutely no single person to blame here. John Lennon simply wanted freedom to pursue new, avant-garde projects. Paul McCartney tried everything in his power to keep the group active and together, though his resulting leadership often felt pretty overbearing to the others. George Harrison urgently needed room for his growing backlog of brilliant songs that were being sidelined, and Ringo Starr just wanted a peaceful life outside of this overwhelming, world-consuming machine. Sometimes, to grow as an individual, you have to leave the ecosystem that built you. Add in the unresolved grief over Epstein's death, the vicious business disputes, and sheer physical exhaustion, and the breakup became completely inevitable.
The actual split happened behind closed doors. In September 1969, John privately told the band he was leaving, but that explosive news was kept strictly secret while they untangled their very messy business contracts. It wasn't until April 1970 that Paul publicly announced his departure, sending absolute shockwaves around the entire globe. The album Let It Be was released shortly after in May. To the general public, the separation felt like this sudden, tragic shock. But as we've seen throughout this explanation, those cracks have been widening for years.
Following the breakup, all four members went on to develop incredibly successful solo careers. There were partial reconciliations and some really beautiful collaborations over the years, but the dream of a definitive reunion was tragically shattered by the senseless murder of John Lennon in 1980, and later, the passing of George Harrison in 2001. Yet, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr continue to tour today, carrying the legacy forward with so much warmth. The Beatles never truly disappeared. Their music is constantly studied, reissued, and discovered by entirely new generations born decades after they stopped playing together.
Which leaves us with this final, powerful question. Do some farewells simply turn a body of work into a legend? Think about it. Four young guys from Liverpool found each other almost by chance. Together, they conquered the entire world and fundamentally changed the DNA of popular music. Later, they needed to separate just to become themselves again. But whenever one of their songs begins to play, for those few magical minutes, John, Paul, George, and Ringo are together once more. And that might just be the real reason why the story of the Beatles still has no ending. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a whole new perspective on the most famous band in history.